Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May edition of the National At-Home Dad Network's webinar series. We are presenting jointly this month with the City Dads Group, and we'd like to welcome Matt Schneider, who's joining us on the call today. We have a really exciting guest with us today. We have Jennifer Wallace. She has written an amazing book that is called Never Enough. It has to do with the pressures that are being put on our kids today and on parents today about high performance and making sure that the accomplishments keep coming and that the kids are constantly on this path for success, and all of the incredible difficulties that this is bringing to our communities and our families. It's an amazing book. It's definitely an issue that we're all dealing with as parents. And without further ado, I'd be more than happy to turn it over to you. Thanks for joining us, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I am so thrilled to be among some dads today, because what I am finding with this book is that it's really resonating with the dads. I think the dads see it. I think they themselves have experienced achievement pressure, just, from a societal level. So I do think it is resonating with them. So thank you so much for having me.
So, it's my understanding you spent almost 4 years researching and writing this book. What brought you to write a book about achievement pressure?
Yeah, so it was 2019, and my son was in 8th grade, my oldest. I have 3 teenagers. My oldest is 17.
Bless you.
Yeah, 17, 15, and 13. And actually, I am a teen proponent. I think these years are actually much easier than the back-breaking years of toddlerhood, where you're always kind of just making sure they stay alive. So I'm thrilled to have teenagers. But it was 2019, and I don't know if you remember the Varsity Blues scandal hit. And that was where, on both coasts, celebrity parents and famous businessmen had federal charges against them for conspiracy and fraud and wire fraud and trying to bribe their way into brand name colleges. And I thought to myself, how did we get here? How did we get to the point where parents were literally going to jail to get their kid into a college? I wasn't buying the narrative that was being told in the newspapers that, parents were consumed with the brand name sticker on the back of their car. And I just thought it was going deeper than that. I was seeing the pressure. I was feeling it in my own home. And then in 2019, I wrote an article for the Washington Post. And it was an article that was talking about how kids who attend competitive high schools around the country, public and private schools, and by competitive, the researchers defined it as most of the kids in these schools go off to 4-year colleges. The schools offer rich extracurriculars, some advanced AP classes. Those kids attending those high-achieving schools were now officially an at-risk group. After kids in poverty, after kids with incarcerated parents, recent immigrants, and children living in foster care, it was these high-achieving kids. And so I wanted to go on a quest and find out why this was and what I could do to buffer against it in my own house. And when I say at risk, what I'm talking about is that these competitive schools, kids attending them are 2 to 6 times more likely to suffer from clinical levels of anxiety, depression, suicide ideation, and substance abuse disorder than the average American teen. So that's extraordinary. Kids who really have all these opportunities are being crushed by the expectations to deliver more and more and more.
And these are the kids that, I hate to use the term, but, when I was in school, these were the kids that were looked at as being the good kids.
Yes.
These weren't the ones that were hanging out behind the gym smoking cigarettes.
Exactly. exactly. That these kids, I was wondering, and I spoke with for this book researchers, historians, anthropologists, and I wanted to know why my children's childhood was so different from my own. And one of the reasons for this, there are many reasons, but one of the reasons is that in the 70s, when I was growing up, life was generally more affordable. Housing, you could afford a home. Housing prices weren't through the roof like they are today. Medical prices, medical bills weren't through the roof. Higher ed wasn't extraordinarily expensive. You could live a, solid middle class life, and you didn't have to, feel like you had to go to a certain college or, um, you know, achieve and achieve and achieve just to kind of make it in the world. But in the last several decades, we have seen huge changes in our society. There has been a crush of the middle class, deep inequity, hyper competition, globalization. The world is more competitive than it was. And what the researchers I spoke with said, parents are absorbing these pressures, and it's coming out in the way we parent. We are social conduits, conditioning our kids for this scary, uncertain future, and we might not even be aware that we're doing it. But these messages that our kids are feeling and that they're getting in the home, at school, on social media, it's overwhelming their capacity to cope.
Now, you said that you had interviewed psychologists and psychiatrists and researchers in this field. Um, Honestly, you mentioned that you had three teens of your own. I mean, what advice did they have that you think helped your family out the most?
Oh yeah. I mean, as soon as I started looking into this, in that very first article where I saw that these kids were at risk, I called the leading researcher of this population and I said, what can I do in my home today? And she said the number one thing is to make home a place where your kids know that they are valued for who they are at their core. That home is a place to recover from extraordinary expectations. And so she said the way to do this is to minimize criticism and prioritize affection. And so, so what I tried to, I said to her, but, as a parent, isn't it my job to, help my kids reach their potential? And she said, yes, but they are getting those messages everywhere. They're getting them from their peers at school. They're getting from their teachers, from their coaches. You don't need to add on to the pressure. Your kids know what the expectations are. You can have a bar, but the bar needs to be adjustable, and your kid must never feel like they need to prove themselves to earn your love.
I mean, that makes complete sense. Now, in addition to the experts, you also interviewed like several families.
Mm.
I would be curious, how did you find the families to interview? I
Yes.
mean, did
So
you just raise your hand and be like, "Do you have teenagers? Call me."
I worked with a researcher at Harvard, who's in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and we designed a parenting survey that I wanted to get to the root of this pressure, and so we created this survey, and I could read you some of the things that the parents said in the survey. But our goal was to get a sample size of 1,000. And within a few days, we had 6,500 families fill out this parent survey. And at the
Wow.
end of the survey, I said to them, if you would be willing to be interviewed for the book, please email me. You could be an anonymous person in my book. You could be named. Hundreds of parents reached out. And so that's where I found the families for my book. But if you're interested, I'd love to read you a few of the things I asked them.
Oh,
Uh,
please.
okay, so one of the things I asked was how much they agreed on a scale from 1 to 4. Uh, I wish today's childhood was less stressful for my kids. 87% of parents agreed or strongly agreed with that statement. I also asked, I feel responsible for my children's achievement and success. 75% of parents agreed or somewhat agreed with that statement. I mean, and anyway, I have lots more that I detail in the book.
I
But
mean,
that you
that
get to,
that first answer makes complete sense. I mean, as parents, that's what we all want for our kids. We want them to be happy. We want them to live a nice, stress-free life, and we want them to be successful as well. The question is, at what point did that normal desire for parents to have your kids achieve and be good at things, at what point did that cross the line
yeah.
and enter into this point that it begins like literally affecting these children's mental health?
Yes. I mean, I think if you were to, fathers, if you were to think back to your childhoods, and I think you would say that you played sports or musical instruments or engaged in extracurricular activities for fun. They were a stress reducer. Now, everything is monetized. You are competing with peers for the A travel soccer team, and that if you don't start, travel soccer or those sports early, your kid's going to be shut out. There has become this early credentializing of our children. One sociologist I interviewed called it competitive capital, that, kids at an early age are, these things that used to reduce stress are now just added sources of pressure for our kids. The other things that I think have changed over the decades is that the buffers that you used to be in place, and by buffers I mean, your friends who used to be the person that you could complain to about your parents or about schoolwork, they are now in many settings competitors. People are competing to get into the state school or the college that you want to get into, and so that interferes with friendships, adolescent friendships. So anyway, the pressures throughout our children's life have ratcheted up, and they have felt it as the pressures in the outside society that has ratcheted up too. It's also and what's different between adults feeling the extra pressure and kids is that kids are not developmentally wired to be able to handle that kind of pressure. And so that's why this researcher that I interviewed talked about making home a haven from the pressure, that kids need a place to recover. And that as much as our job is to, raise kids who can thrive in the future, we have to be mindful of their developmental abilities.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, when you talk about making sure that home can be a refuge, in the book, you talk a whole lot about the importance of kids mattering. Um, can you fill the other people in a little bit more about that? Because I thought that was a really, really great concept and a word that I hadn't really attached to parenting, but I really like it a lot.
Thank you so much, Matt. So I was, in the book, I was looking for who were the kids who were doing well despite the pressure. What did they have in common? What was home life like for them? What was school like? What did their parents focus on at home? What were the messages they were sent? And I came across about 14 things that these healthy achievers had in common. And as I was looking for a framework to present this to parents, I came across this construct that you just that you spoke about, called mattering. And mattering is an idea, a psychological term that's been around since the 1980s. It was conceptualized by the same guy who brought us the self-esteem movement, Marty Rosenberg. And what he found was that kids who enjoyed a healthy level of self-esteem felt like they mattered to their parents. They felt valued And they were also depended on to add meaningful value back. And so the kids that I found who were the healthy achievers had a high level of mattering. They felt valued by their family, by their friends, by their wider community, their neighbors. They also were relied on to add value back to their family, to their peers, to the wider community. And it became this upward positive spiral that helped them overcome setbacks, and reach for even higher goals. They had this confidence that no matter what, failure wasn't an indictment of their self-worth. They mattered no matter what. And they had that strong sense. It didn't mean that they weren't anxious sometimes, didn't mean that they weren't down, or that they didn't, experience the whole range of emotions that make us human. It's that they were able to bounce back. They were able to be more resilient in the face of challenges because they had this mattering.
So in the meeting right now, we've got Chris and Jesse both asked almost the exact same question. They were asking about the demographic data of those people who participated, specifically the parental education level and family socioeconomic status,
That is
because
a great question. So I conducted the study, and the Harvard researcher weighted it so that it was a nationally representative sample. Because it was distributed via a snowball effect, is what the researchers call it, meaning that, you send it out to some networks and then they forward it to other networks, and it was found on parenting groups, that the majority of parents were in the top 25% of household incomes, which, depending on where you live, is roughly a combined income of about $130,000 a year. So, two school teachers, it was, so this data was the weighted, meaning that this was not the high achieving communities answered
gotcha.
questions. But I'm so glad you asked that, because I do have two ways that we concluded the research. One that just looked at these high achieving communities, and others that looked at a swath of, America. They were not as dissimilar as you might think they were. So what I found interesting was that in certain demographics, certain areas of the country, parents were more focused on maybe getting their child into an elite college, a selective college, which is something like, an acceptance rate of 30% or less. Other areas of the country were very fixated on sports, and they put a lot of achievement pressure on their kids when it came to sports. And then another group were very focused on trying to get scholarship money and getting their children into the flagship university that 30 years ago had an acceptance rate of 70% and now is less than 50%. So it's really the kind of, what's interesting about the book is that, and I say in the intro, the majority of the parents that I interviewed for the book, not all, but the majority of the parents were in this top 25% income level, because that's where these high achieving schools generally are. It's in those suburbs. And so the parents that, I sort of targeted this book were parents who had enough money that they could choose where they lived. Now, there are definitely families that I interviewed who are low income families who sent their kids either with scholarship money or to charter schools.
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of families interviewed for this book, not surveyed, but interviewed, did fall in that top 25% of household incomes.
Well, again, I don't have any background in psychiatry or in psychology or sociology, but it makes sense to me that the two extremes of the spectrum would be where the most pressure is. Those kids who come from families where mom and dad are highly motivated and highly successful feel like they have something to live up to. and the ones that come from the lower income families feel this obligation to rise above the conditions that they were in, and those, I could see where those pressures would definitely weigh.
And the healthiest kids are the kids who are growing up in according to the research, uh, a middle class environment. And one of the reasons researchers believe this is because when you're growing up in a high achieving community, where you are surrounded by parents who, generally one of them went to a 4-year college, they have high expectations, they have a narrower definition of what success looks like. It is, I call it in the book, the encore effect, and the pressure on kids to replicate their childhoods. So, when I was growing up in the 70s, I grew up in a, nice upper middle class family, but it was certainly within reach that
Mm-hmm.
I could replicate. It is so much harder now to replicate your childhood than it has ever been, because of these macroeconomic pressures. And our kids are absorbing that. I will tell you like 2 quick stories. My daughter was so my kids, when they turned 14, all got their working papers, and they work in the summers. And my daughter was saving money this summer, and I was not spending any of it. And I said, "What are you saving for?" And she said, "For food when I'm in my 20s." And I was like, "Why are you saving for food?" And she said, "I've been hearing about inflation and how expensive everything is. And I want to be able to afford food when I'm in my 20s." Now, is that ever anything you ever thought of when you were 15 years old? The
It does
inflation
now.
of food? So these, whether our kids are expressing it or not, this is on their minds.
Yeah. Now, does this stress affect a child's way of learning?
Yes.
And if it does, can you expand on that? Again, great questions coming from our audience today.
Yes, I will tell you, which I find so fascinating, um, that stress. So I'll give you a few examples of stress. Like, let's pretend there's a child who, is in middle school or in high school and does not
Huh?
feel a sense of belonging, feels a lot of
What
competition with
happened?
peers. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's fine.
Okay. Who what?
Really?
I think somebody's not on mute.
Yep. I just muted.
Okay, awesome. So let's say you have a student who doesn't feel a sense of belonging in the classroom, or feels overly pressured, to score a good grade on that test, or they're going to go home and their parents can be really angry with them. That hijacks cognitive ability. So the brain power that should be going to taking that test or that quiz instead is being hijacked and used for worry, sort of scanning the environment. If it's a child who doesn't feel like they belong, scanning the environment for threats, social threat, or a child who is worried that their parents only love them when. That also hurts performance. So the kids that I found that were struggling the most in these communities were kids who either felt like their mattering was contingent on how they performed, or, and this I found surprising but makes total sense, the kids who were never asked to add value to anyone other than themselves. The kids who were so focused on their own resume, building up their own sports ability, that they didn't have chores at home, that they weren't, doing meaningful volunteer work in the community or at their school, or helping a neighbor, an elderly neighbor who might need it. Those kids were so self-focused, that it caused, real turmoil in their brains. Their successes and their failures were magnified because they didn't have a broader sense of their place in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. And in the book, you talk about the importance of opening up kids to spaces in their homes and schools and around their community where they can genuinely help other people.
Yes.
And you know, again, the National At Home Dad Network is a 100% volunteer organization. So we definitely understand that sense of fulfillment that you get from volunteering and making a difference. It never really occurred to me how important that could be to kids.
Yeah, I'll be honest, it didn't occur to me either. And I wrote, and the first time it occurred to me, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about why children need chores. Um, and the reason for chores is not just to make home life a little easier, which is super nice, but the real reason for chores and the reason I got my kids to start doing them is because family is the first introduction to society for a kid. And so learning how to be a functioning member of the family, knowing that your family needs you and they rely on you, it gives you a sense of mattering. It gives you social proof that you matter beyond the words of a parent. And so chores or pointing out how much a grandparent could use help with X or Y, or the elderly neighbor who might need somebody to bring in her, simple things like the newspaper at the, foot of the driveway for an elderly person to pick it up and put it on their stoop. That's meaningful. That's
Hmm.
adding value to somebody else's life.
I
And
mean,
those
it's funny. I also grew up in the '70s. I was born in '72, but I literally remember being a kid, and there was an older lady who lived at the end of our street, and all the kids in the neighborhood would alternate just going and bringing her mail to her because she was always just sitting out on the porch, watching the neighborhood. But we would all stop by and open her mailbox and just bring her mail to her.
How
I mean,
lovely,
for the life of me, couldn't tell you what her name was or anything at this point in my life, but I do remember doing it.
right? And you probably remember doing it because you remember how good it felt
Yeah.
to be able
Now,
to help somebody. Yeah.
Chris asked a really important question. You were talking about how the family is a great example of like where children fit in a society. But in the modern age that we live in, society has become so much bigger with the advent of social media. When I was growing up, my entire world consisted of a neighborhood and a small, like, elementary school. Whereas now, the minute kids get on social media, they're a part of, like, the whole planet.
Yes.
Um, did you find a correlation between a child's perception of pressures and expectations with their use of social media?
Yeah. So what I found, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, is that the kids who were struggling socially and with their own self-esteem, on in real life were the same kids who were struggling on social media. So, one of the red flags for a parent, according to the research, is if a child starting around seventh grade, if a child starts expressing or showing you extreme envy, that they're really envying their peers, hyper competitive with them and not able to manage those feelings. And it's those kids who do the constant social comparisons, who go on social media and sort of use it in problematic ways. So one of the solutions in the book is to, and I one of the chapters is actually devoted to envy and competition. And it's inevitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're wired to feel envy, and there's a real evolutionary purpose to envy. Envy, it can be, when used well, benign envy is a motivator, right? You can see what somebody else has. And, evolutionary psychologists believe that we inherited this feeling of envy and that it's a universal feeling, across countries, because envy helps us to zoom in on our target and what they have that we think might be useful for our survival. And so, what is it that this person has? How did they get it? We can sort of dismantle the pressures of envy or the yucky emotions of envy by saying to our kids, "This is normal. Everybody
Mm-hmm.
feels these feelings." We can alleviate the shame of it and say, "You don't have to judge yourself for feeling envious. You have to judge yourself for how you act on that envy. So you can
That makes
feel that
sense.
envy. We can talk about it at home. We can unpack it. I can show you how to move from what psychologists call malicious envy to a more benign envy. But I think kids really want to hide it. And actually, studies have found that it's the number one emotion we never want to admit to is envy, because in doing it makes us look like we're lacking.
Hmm.
So it is like this shameful emotion that we feel that's universal. And I think having these conversations about it have certainly been so helpful for my own kids.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Now, Billy just asked on chores, does it matter how you enlist your kids' help?
Oh, I
Like one of his kids seems to be naturally inclined to help without being asked, whereas the other one seems determined to resist anything that is not gamified or made fun.
oh my gosh,
And I totally feel this, Billy.
I do too, Billy. Same thing in my house. So what the researchers who study chores talk about is that for chores to be really meaningful, it they need to be something that helps the family. So making your bed, cleaning your room is like helping yourself. So I would say that's a chore that like I wouldn't even necessarily count. I think so I gamified one of my chores for my third child and actually my second. Um, so we were teaching them laundry, how to do the laundry. And so I talked about it in levels. I was like, let's see if you can master level one. And level one was sorting. And so after doing that for a few days, I was like, wow, you've leveled up. You're up to level two now. And that means putting, the darks in and noticing, the cold water and how to put in. So leveled up. Then the final level was to be able to figure out how to use the dryer, what went in the dryer. And so we gamified it. It's lost a little of its luster, I will say, as time gone on. And I have an oldest son. My oldest is somebody who just does without asking very often. And so one of the things that we implemented in our family that I have found to be so helpful is something called the family meeting. And it's 10 minutes a week. It was an idea that was first brought up by psychologist Alfred Adler, who was a Freud colleague, and they went their separate ways. But what Adler found was that the family meeting, literally 10 minutes, and actually with younger kids, I'd say 5 minutes. You have one person who watches the time, another person sets the agenda. So everybody in the family has a role. Maybe one other person finds a snack for the family meeting. And what you talk about are the needs of the family. So this week, here are some of the things we need to do. And then you have the kids sort of sign up for how they're going to help the family. So we do that on Saturdays. It's less than 10 minutes and it's just a way to regroup. But my kids generally fall into patterns of what they like to do. Like my youngest likes to be in charge of the kitchen floor. My oldest likes to be in charge of laundry. My daughter will help with grocery shopping. So they sort of fall into what they choose to do. But I have found that when they sign up for things, when they ask for things, that they tend to do them without much struggle.
Yeah, that makes sense. Now going back to when you were talking about how mattering was really important. It's a really neat concept, but do you have any examples of ways that like we can, explicitly show our kids that they matter, in practice, not just as a concept?
Yes. So, there are many factors that I lay out in the book of all, and actually, if you pre-order the book, my publisher has given exclusive content to anybody who pre-orders the book, which is several pages of messages of mattering and actions parents can do to create mattering at home. There's also The Secrets of the Healthy Strivers and a couple of chapters in the book, and also how I have implemented these strategies in my own house. So I'll give you an example of my son. So my kids, like your kids, went through COVID. My kids were early adolescents, and we live in New York City. So we actually got out of the city for much of COVID. We were living in a house with my husband's family. And so my kids were not with their peers. They texted with them. They occasionally saw them on Facebook, but particularly my oldest son, who was a freshman in high school. He felt lonely not seeing
Yeah.
he really did not feel a sense of mattering with his peers. So he goes in sophomore year, spring is when he was back to school full time. And he was really feeling lonely. And a few of his friends said to him, I know baseball isn't your thing, but we are short one JV player. Would you be willing to consider joining the team so that we can play against other schools? So my son, who really is more academic than he is sports minded, came home and he was like, well, this really, it's 3-hour commitment every day after school with the travel time and all of that. And like, I don't know, my grades might go down if I join the team, but they really need me. And I said, well, what do you want to do? And he said, I really want to do it. So I said, I think you should absolutely do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I was thinking in that moment, had I not researched this book, I probably would have thought in my head, oh, sophomore year, your grades count. You should really focus on your grades. You don't really play baseball. Like, this is a
It's
little
not going
random.
to lead to a
Not
scholarship.
going to lead to a scholarship, not going to do anything, and just kind of take away from your study time. But I knew that he was lacking mattering with his peers. And I knew this would give him that chance. And it did. I cannot tell you the transformation. Joining that team, he wasn't the best on the team, but he had some hits. He got some outs. He made it on the base. And his friends actively appreciated him and thanked him time and again for joining the team. And it actually created an upward spiral in him. It gave him this extra motivation. And actually, all of his grades went up, despite the fact that for 3 hours after school, he couldn't work. He was so motivated. He literally, it was the best year academically that he's ever had.
That's
And
awesome.
it was, I would say, 1000% because he felt like he mattered to his classmates. And he
Now,
got proof that he did.
now, speaking of that whole like mattering to your peers, when we first announced that we were having you on, one of the things that we did was we reached out to our network and said, do any of you guys have some questions you want to ask ahead of time? And one question that really hit home was that what advice do you have for the kids who are achieving and they are high achievers already, but they're being bullied or judged at school because of their high success?
So I guess I would have to know more about how that success is being played out in the classroom. Is the teacher hitting students against each other? Are they saying, "Oh, look at how Johnny does this"? So in other words, is there something that's exacerbating it at school? I would also, I think, help that child find other ways of connecting beyond to peers beyond the academics. Is there a club he or she could join? Where, what happens, I think, often is, and I have one of my children is like officially gifted, actually known as 2E, dyslexic and gifted. And so a lot of his self-esteem is based on his academic work. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I've actively done is um, so what I would say to this parent is try to get a PhD in your kid and find out other things about them that you can stress as their strengths. So for example, is this highly academic kid, do they have a great sense of humor? And how can they use that? How can they lean on that humor to help them in these? My daughter was in 7th grade at the lunchroom, And, there was the typical seventh grade girl drama. And she
Mm-hmm.
came home, and we had done something called the VIA survey, VIA survey. It's free, it's online. It was created by the two fathers of positive psychology, Marty Seligman and Christopher Peterson, and 44 other researchers. And so it's like a 10 to 15-minute survey, totally free, that will tell you what your natural strengths are. And they also created a VIA survey for kids. And if you want to figure out what makes your kid tick, take that survey with them and print out their strengths and lean into those strengths whenever they're having problems, like what you're talking about with the academic student. What are
Yeah.
the other strengths that that kid has that he or she can use and lean on to get through that? So it could be humor, could be empathy, could be talking to them about,
So
jealousy.
Floor, who's watching live with us here in the meeting, was asking where can we find that survey, and also the father that submitted that question let us know that it is definitely a peer-to-peer situation. The teacher was not even aware of it until the parents made the teacher aware of the situation.
That's hard. I think without knowing all the details, I think having frank conversations with your kids about how sometimes people are jealous and it comes out sideways when they're not able to express it and use their words and they don't have the skills to handle it. And so what that child could be experiencing is the ugly side of envy and jealousy that is not unpacked. I also think that the teacher and the school psychologist should be aware of it because, the research points out that kids who bully are very vulnerable themselves. There's a reason. Kids do not, just naturally start bullying people. I know that we believe, oh, boys will be boys or girls will be,
Oh, we hate that. We hate that
I
phrase.
hate that too.
Absolutely despise that phrase.
Absolutely despise it. It's totally flawed. And what it means is the kids don't have the skills. And so I would be, having the school work on those skills with the kids because that child who's bullying is suffering themselves.
Now, we did have one more question, and then we're going to have to start moving towards wrapping this up because we are approaching. We got about 18 minutes left before we hit 2 o'clock, and believe it or not, I have to go pick my children up at 2 o'clock, and then drive across town to get one of them to an archery lesson. But it's the only thing that my children that child does. That's their one extracurricular. The other one is in scouting, but um, Gary asked any advice for parenting a child that has a natural achievement perfectionist type traits.
Yes. Oh boy, I do because I found that in my own family too. So I wrote an article for the Washington Post on this, and I talk about it in the book about how children get perfectionism. It is on the rise in young adults, and that's because of the pressures of society. And so it's something to take seriously. I'm glad that you're, whoever the parent is, really taking perfectionism seriously. So what I did was, because I was noticing it in one of my kids, was I looked at the research and I saw that one of the pathways for kids to become perfectionists is through the parent and most often the mother. And I was noticing my own, so that I had to unpack my own perfectionistic tendencies. And what I started to do was to be very overt about modeling for my kids how I talk to myself. So instead of using, because what's happening with the perfectionist is that they have this critical voice inside their head telling them they're not enough, this isn't good enough, you're not enough. And so what I started doing was modeling in front of my kids. So for example, my daughter was exhibiting these tendencies and she was being a perfectionist about her writing. And I said to her, I know just how you feel. And I brought her over to my computer screen. And it was my first edit with the Washington Post science section with a 30-year veteran editor. And there were red marks on every sentence. It was a horror show, bloodbath. And my daughter's eyes were like wide open. She's like, oh my God, I can't believe they let you write for them. And I said, you know what? I look at that as like this person investing in me, that it wasn't good yet, but that it could get good. And so I call it living life out loud. I think the more you can model, if so when I make a mistake, if I forget to do something or I'm late to do something, I say, oh, I'm frustrated with myself. I'll say this out loud. I'm frustrated with myself, but you know what? I'm really trying the best I can. So I think that's enough. I think I need to be kind to myself now. And modeling self-compassion. Like, that's okay, Jenny. You'll get better at this. It seems to be helping.
Okay. Yeah, I could definitely see that. Now, the book is coming out in August,
Yes.
but you've arranged for a special two chapter excerpt, as well as like practical tips that parents can start using right away. Please, while we have time, can you explain to our audience how it is that they can access that so
Great.
that they can go and do it? I will point out, big thanks to Matt Schneider, who's been posting links in the chat right now to everything from that VIA survey down to where to pre-order your book.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, Matt. So if you order on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or your local bookseller, if you buy the book and you go to my website, there will be a pre-order, and Matt probably has it on the link there. If
Yep.
you go to my website and you go to Never Enough, and you will see there's a way to pre-order the book, and then you put your name, your email, and the order number of your receipt, and you will get in your email box the 2 chapters, the tips, the secrets of healthy strivers, lots and lots of information. My publisher was so generous. I'm so thrilled to be able to offer that. And that's stuff that you won't get after the pub date. So a lot of that. And so there's one other thing. You can sign up on my website to
Which
get
is the www.jenniferwallace.com.
Jennifer B. Wallace.
Jennifer B. Wallace.
JenniferBWallace.com. And if you have questions with the pre-ordering, if anything, if you have trouble, I have somebody who monitors my contact form and she will help you out. But you can sign up, and I will be starting a newsletter soon. And I also am co-founding something called the Mattering Movement, which is going to be a resource for parents and teachers on how to lead with mattering, how to motivate with mattering in healthy ways, how to motivate your kids with what I call clean fuel, as opposed to dirty fuel, and which is sort of motivating out of fear. Anyway, if you join the Mattering Movement, there's also a Facebook page that you could go on. And anyway, there are lots of resources.
Matt is dropping all those links in there,
Matt,
like
so
as
much.
quickly as you could rattle, as you're rattling them off.
Awesome.
Which
Thank you so much.
I definitely really do appreciate the time that you've given us. I want to send out a special thank you to Matt Schneider and the City Dads Group, who helped us identify you guys, or identify you and bring you to our webinar series so that we could share this. This has been an absolutely fantastic experience for everybody who's been here.
Thank you.
And I think this is something that we all really do need to pay attention to. My children are in kindergarten and third grade, and there are already discussions about which school is the funnel school to go into the international baccalaureate school or the art school. And again, I that didn't exist when I was a kid. When we were in elementary school, honestly, they were just happy that we weren't eating paste. The bar was a little lower.
I totally agree. It's too much, and there's a better way, and there's a more enjoyable way to parent. And that's what I love about Mattering, is that you can actually really enjoy the parenting these years. You can enjoy these years. It takes work. You have to find your people, which is why I started the Mattering movement, so that we could have this community of people who, want to find another way. We want our kids to achieve, but in healthy ways. We want help. We want long-term achievement. We don't want kids burnt out. I mean, just to leave you with this, right? You get your kid into a college, and there are so many kids burning out of college because of this 12 years of achievement pressure that colleges are now accepting students for sophomore year, meaning that they know that X percentage of kids are going to drop out. And so sophomore year, they're going to be short students. It is a major issue. So if you want that long-term achievement, it doesn't even have to be college. Achievement, it does not have to be so narrow the way it's defined today. There are so many ways to define it.
And that is a big difference in growing up. I graduated high school in 1990, and I remember sitting down with the guidance counselor. And when I was talking to the guidance counselor, we were told that there were like 3 options when you got out of high school. You either went to college, you joined the military, or you were going to be a failure for the rest of your life. No one once mentioned to me that even back in the 90s, the average plumber was making a 6-figure income.
Exactly.
Or electricians, or all of these other wonderful, there's a lack of tradesmen all around the country right now. And it's a way to make a living, and it's, in a lot of ways,
I can tell you now, if I could do it over again, I would have gone to a trade school instead of a 4-year college.
Yeah. I mean, I started at a 4-year college, dropped out after 2 years, and then 10 years later paid my own way through trade school to continue my career as a chef.
Oh, wow.
Again, if I could go back and redo it, I wouldn't have wasted 2 years at an undergraduate college, and I would have just gone to culinary school from the get-go.
And the money and the cost and the debt.
Mm-hmm.
100% agree. There are so many paths.
I actually just finished paying off all of my student loans about 3 months ago at the age of 51, which is just brutal. Disturbing to think about.
Brutal.
Well, again, everybody has been just pouring out love, talking about how great this has been. I think that people are really excited about reading your book. I do want to let everybody know that the National At-Home Dad Network, as well as City Dads Group, please look us up online. City Dads Group is a great organization. I'm a little biased, but the National At-Home Dad Network is also a great organization, and we offer a lot of things out there for everybody. Coming up next month in June, I don't have an exact date yet, but we're going to do something a little bit lighter. I'm going to bring on one of my neighbors, a gentleman named Frank Hyman. And Frank actually is the author of a wonderful book called How to Forage Mushrooms and Not Die. When the pandemic started, me and my kids began doing a whole lot of walking. And we started seeing mushrooms everywhere. And we actually began doing our research and figuring out how to forage. My kids still won't eat most of the mushrooms, but they really love finding them. And it's become a really great family activity for us to get us out of the house, away from screens. As I tell most people, the worst day of trying to forage mushrooms is still an amazing hike in the woods. Even if you don't find anything, you still manage to get out. Matt, if you would, can you drop the link to City Dads Group in there? Because I don't know y'all's web address off the top of my head. There it is. Oh, perfect. But on behalf of the National At-Home Dad Network and City Dads Group, we want to thank you for joining us, Jennifer. We want to thank everybody who came to experience the entire webinar. And again, thank you guys so much. It's so great to see so many people wanting to put in the work to be better parents. It makes me feel good inside. So on behalf of everybody have a great day, and thank you guys so much.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.